Dad, I'm canceling our family dinner tonight. Something came up.
Those were my daughter Sarah's exact words, delivered with the kind of casualness you'd use to cancel a dentist appointment. I'm Harold Thompson, 74 years old, been a widower for 2 years since my beloved wife Martha passed, and I'm about to tell you a story that will shake your faith in family loyalty. But before I do, tell me what city you're listening from and share this story with someone who knows what it feels like to be taken for granted by the people you love most, because what happened next exposed a betrayal so calculated it still takes my breath away. When I showed up at that house anyway, I found my entire family celebrating without me, laughing, eating, drinking, all paid for with my own credit card. I said absolutely nothing that night, walked out in complete silence, but what I did next taught them a lesson about respect they'll carry for the rest of their lives. That phone call came on a Thursday afternoon at exactly 3:47 p.m., and I remember the time because I was watching Judge Judy tear apart some deadbeat who hadn't paid his rent. I'd been sitting in my leather recliner, the same one Martha picked out at Sears 15 years ago, nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. The house felt bigger than usual that day, the way it always did when the Ohio winter started creeping through the windows and reminding me I was living alone. When the phone rang, I actually felt a little spark of excitement because Friday night couldn't come fast enough. Robert's 50th birthday party at Sarah's house, the whole family together, maybe some good barbecue and stories that would make us all laugh until our sides hurt. "Hey, Daddy," Sarah said when I picked up, but something in her voice made me sit up straighter. There was this rushed quality to it, like she was reading from a script she wanted to get through quickly. In 32 years of being her father, I'd learned to read my daughter's moods through the phone better than most people read faces. This wasn't her normal voice. This was her, "I'm about to disappoint you, but I'm going to make it sound reasonable" voice. "Hi, sweetheart," I said, muting the TV.
Perfect timing.
I was just thinking about tomorrow night. Should I pick up that German chocolate cake from Mueller's Bakery?
The one Robert always raves about.
I was already planning the drive across town, already imagining his face when he saw his favorite dessert. That's the thing about being a father and grandfather, you start living for those little moments of joy you can create for your family. "Actually, Daddy, that's why I'm calling." The words came out fast, like she was ripping off a Band-Aid.
I need to cancel dinner tomorrow night.
Something came up with Robert's work situation, and we have to postpone everything.
The coffee mug froze halfway to my lips.
Cancel? But we've been planning this for 3 weeks. I already took the day off tomorrow to help you set up. Which was true. I'd marked it on my calendar, turned down a poker game with the guys from the American Legion, even bought Robert a new socket wrench set that was sitting wrapped on my kitchen counter. I know, and I'm really sorry," she continued, but there was something hollow about her apology. "It's just that Robert's boss called an emergency meeting for tomorrow night, something about a big project deadline.
You know how demanding his job is."
I knew Robert worked as a middle manager at some insurance company downtown. Hardly the kind of position that demanded emergency Friday night meetings, but I didn't say that. What I did notice was the sound in the background. It was faint, but I could swear I heard laughter and what sounded like multiple voices talking at once. "Sarah, is someone there with you right now?"
"What?"
"No, just watching TV."
"Listen, Daddy, I really have to run."
Robert's stressed about this work thing, and I need to help him prepare. "We'll reschedule for next weekend, okay? I promise we'll make it even better." The phone went dead before I could respond. I sat there holding the receiver, staring at Judge Judy's face on the muted screen, feeling like something fundamental had just shifted in my world. In all the years since Martha died, Sarah had never canceled a family dinner. Not once. Even when she had the flu 2 Christmases ago, she insisted we come over and she'd cook from her sickbed. But what bothered me more than the cancellation was that background noise. Those voices didn't sound like a television. They sounded like people having a conversation, maybe even preparing for something. I replayed every word of our conversation in my head, and the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that my daughter had just lied to me. The question was why. You don't spend 40 years in construction without developing a sixth sense for when something's about to collapse. It starts as a feeling in your gut, a little voice that says, "Check that beam twice," or "Those measurements don't add up." Martha used to call it my bloodhound nose for trouble, and she was right. That same instinct that kept me from getting crushed by falling scaffolding or electrocuted by faulty wiring was now screaming at me that Sarah's story had more holes than a termite-eaten floorboard. I replayed that phone conversation in my head at least 20 times that evening, picking apart every word like I was reading blueprints. The rushed tone wasn't like Sarah at all. When my daughter has bad news to deliver, she usually beats around the bush for 10 minutes before getting to the point. She'll ask about my health, comment on the weather, tell me some story about her students at the elementary school.
But today, straight to business, straight to the cancellation, straight off the phone.
That wasn't my Sarah. Then there was Robert's supposed work emergency. I'd met his boss Dave Henderson at last year's company picnic, a laid-back guy who talked more about his bass fishing hobby than insurance policies. Dave was the type who probably forgot his own birthday, let alone called emergency Friday night meetings. Plus, Robert had been complaining for months about how slow things were at the office, how they were barely keeping busy enough to justify their staff. Emergency meetings don't happen at companies where people spend half their day playing solitaire on their computers. But what really got my attention was that background noise. I'd been listening to voices through phone lines for 7 decades, and I knew the difference between television chatter and real people talking. What I heard behind Sarah's voice was the sound of activity, preparation, maybe even excitement. Someone laughed during our conversation, a genuine laugh, not the canned laughter from some sitcom. And there was a metallic clinking sound, like silverware being arranged on a table. Around 9 o'clock that night, I found myself standing in my kitchen staring at that bag of coleslaw ingredients, and something Martha used to say popped into my head. "Hank Thompson," she'd tell me when I was overthinking some work problem, "your brain is like a smoke detector. Sometimes it goes off when you burn toast, but when there's a real fire, you better pay attention." This felt like a real fire. I thought about calling Michael to see if he knew anything about Robert's work situation, but my older son had a way of making me feel paranoid when I voiced suspicions about family members. "Dad, you're reading too much into things," he'd say, same tone he used when I worried about him driving in bad weather or working too many overtime hours. Michael meant well, but he'd inherited his mother's tendency to assume the best about people, even when the evidence suggested otherwise. The more I thought about it, the more I realized this wasn't just about a canceled dinner. This was about a pattern I'd been too blind to see. How many times in the past 2 years had family plans changed at the last minute? How many gatherings had I arrived at where everyone seemed surprised to see me, like they'd forgotten I was coming? How many conversations had stopped abruptly when I walked into a room? I'd attributed all of that to people being busy, to the natural chaos of family life, to everyone still adjusting to Martha's absence. But what if it wasn't chaos at all? What if it was coordination? What if the common denominator in all those awkward moments wasn't bad timing, but me? By 10:30, I'd made a decision that would have made Martha proud and worried her at the same time. I was going to trust my instincts, the same ones that had kept me alive and successful for 74 years. Tomorrow night, canceled dinner or not, I was going to drive over to Sarah's house and see for myself what kind of work emergency required canceling a birthday party that had been planned for weeks. If I was wrong, I'd apologize and maybe bring that German chocolate cake as a peace offering. But if I was right, if my own daughter had looked me in the eye and lied to me, then we were going to have a conversation about honesty that was long overdue. Friday morning I woke up at 5:30, same as I had every day for the past 50 years. Old habits die hard when you've spent decades getting to construction sites before sunrise. But instead of my usual routine of coffee, newspaper, and wondering how to fill another empty day, I had purpose. I was going to get to the bottom of whatever was happening at Sarah's house, and I was going to do it right. First stop was Mueller's Bakery on Main Street. If I was wrong about this whole thing, if Robert really did have some legitimate work emergency, then I wanted to show up with something that would make my unexpected visit feel like a pleasant surprise rather than a suspicious father checking up on his daughter. Heinrich Mueller had been baking that German chocolate cake for 30 years, and it was Robert's absolute weakness. The man would eat half a cake in one sitting if nobody stopped him.
The usual birthday cake, Hank?
Heinrich asked when I walked in. The old German immigrant had known our family since Sarah was in diapers. Thought you might be coming by today. Sarah mentioned Robert's big 5-0 when she was in here Wednesday. That stopped me cold. Sarah was here Wednesday? Yeah, picked up 2 dozen of those fancy cupcakes with the cream cheese frosting. Said she was planning quite a spread for tonight. Heinrich wrapped the cake in his signature blue and white striped box, the same pattern he'd been using since 1987. Must be some party if she's ordering from here and making her own food. I paid for the cake with cash, tipped Heinrich an extra $5, and walked back to my truck feeling like a detective who'd just found a crucial piece of evidence. 2 dozen fancy cupcakes weren't something you bought for a canceled party. They weren't something you bought for a quiet dinner that got postponed due to work emergencies. They were something you bought when you were feeding a crowd. My next stop was Walmart for a bottle of that expensive bourbon Robert always requested but never bought for himself. Woodford Reserve, $28 a bottle, the kind of gift that showed you were thinking about someone's happiness, not just showing up empty-handed. As I stood in the liquor aisle, I caught my reflection in the security mirror and realized I looked exactly like what I was, a 74-year-old man trying to buy his way back into his own family's good graces. But that wasn't what this was about, was it? This was about trust. This was about whether the daughter I'd raised to value honesty above everything else had looked me in the eye, metaphorically speaking, and lied to me about something as basic as a family dinner. If she had, then that bourbon and cake weren't peace offerings. They were props in a confrontation that was long overdue. I spent the afternoon preparing like I was going into battle, which maybe I was. Shower, shave, the blue button-down shirt Sarah always said brought out my eyes. Black slacks that Martha had bought me for church, polished until they looked almost new. I wanted to look like someone who belonged at a birthday party, someone whose presence would be welcome rather than awkward. Around 4 o'clock, I called my neighbor Bill Patterson to ask if he could keep an eye on my house while I was out. Not because I expected to be gone long, but because I had no idea what I was walking into, and at my age, you don't take chances with unplanned confrontations.
You okay, Hank?
Bill asked.
You sound different today.
More like the old you. The old me. I knew what he meant. Before Martha died, I'd been the guy who fixed problems, who took charge when situations needed handling. Somewhere in the past 2 years, I'd become the guy who let problems happen to him, who accepted whatever treatment people thought he deserved because he was grateful just to be included. By 6:15, I was sitting in my truck outside Sarah's house at 428 Maple Street, engine running, cake and bourbon on the passenger seat, watching the windows for signs of life. The driveway was empty, but that didn't mean anything. If Sarah was lying about the party being canceled, she might have asked people to park somewhere else so the neighbors wouldn't know how many people were there. 7 o'clock was when dinner was supposed to start. I was going to give them until 7:15, then walk up to that front door and see what kind of work emergency required German chocolate cake and cream cheese cupcakes. At exactly 7:15, I turned off the engine and sat in the growing darkness outside Sarah's house, listening to my own heartbeat and hoping like hell I was about to make a fool of myself. The street was quiet except for the Henderson's dog barking 3 houses down and the distant sound of a television coming from somewhere nearby. Sarah's house looked normal from the outside, porch light on, curtains drawn, nothing to suggest anything other than a quiet Friday night at home. But as I walked up the brick pathway I'd helped Robert lay 2 summers ago, I started noticing details that didn't fit the story I'd been told. The grass had been freshly cut, which seemed odd for someone dealing with a work emergency. The front flower beds had been weeded recently, and there were 2 bags of mulch stacked neatly by the garage that hadn't been there when I drove by last weekend. This was the kind of yard preparation you did when you were expecting company, not when you were canceling social events. I raised my hand to knock on the front door, but before my knuckles could make contact, I heard something that stopped me cold. Laughter. Not just one person, but multiple voices, the kind of overlapping conversation that happens when you get a group of people together around a dinner table. And underneath that, music. Not television music, but actual background music, the kind you put on when you're hosting a party. My chest felt tight as I moved away from the front door and walked around to the side of the house, where a gap in the curtains gave me a direct view into the dining room.
What is how the rhythm like a physical blow, like Someone e taken a sledgehammer to my ribcage and knocked all the air out of my lungs.
There was my entire family, seated around Sarah's dining room table, laughing and eating and celebrating like they didn't have a care in the world.
Robert sat at the head of the table wearing a paper birthday hat, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning.
Sarah was bringing out a cake, not the German chocolate cake I'd bought that afternoon, but an elaborate 2-layer creation with "Happy 50th Birthday" written in blue frosting. My son Michael was there with his wife Jennifer and their 2 kids, my grandchildren who I hadn't seen in 3 weeks because they'd been too busy with school activities. But it wasn't just my immediate family. My brother-in-law Frank was there, Martha's sister Dorothy, even my old neighbor Pete Morrison who'd moved across town last year. This wasn't some impromptu gathering that had happened after the cancellation. This was the party, the exact party that was supposed to include me, happening exactly as planned, just without the guest of honor's father. I stood there in the cold October air, watching my family celebrate through that window like I was looking at someone else's life, someone else's family. They were all dressed up, everyone had brought gifts, and the table was set with Sarah's good china, the wedding set that Martha and I had given her 8 years ago. This was a full production, weeks in the planning, not something you could pull together on short notice after a work emergency got resolved. The worst part wasn't just that they were celebrating without me. It was how happy they all looked. Nobody seemed concerned about my absence. Nobody was checking their phone to see if I'd called. Nobody appeared to be missing anything or anyone. They were having the time of their lives, and I wasn't even a memory in that room. I watched Robert blow out his birthday candles while everyone cheered, and I realized this wasn't just about one lie or one canceled dinner. This was about my family deciding that their lives were better without me in them. That whatever I brought to family gatherings, whatever value I thought I added, was actually just an obligation they'd rather avoid. Standing there in the darkness, holding a German chocolate cake and a bottle of expensive bourbon for a man who was already celebrating his birthday without me, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not just hurt, though that was there in waves. Not just anger, though that was building like a storm front. What I felt was clarity, cold and sharp as winter air. My family had made a choice about what my place was in their lives. Now it was time for me to make some choices of my own. At exactly 7:15, I turned off the engine and sat in the growing darkness outside Sarah's house, listening to my own heartbeat and hoping like hell I was about to make a fool of myself. The street was quiet except for the Hendersons' dog barking 3 houses down and the distant sound of a television coming from somewhere nearby. Sarah's house looked normal from the outside, porch light on, curtains drawn, nothing to suggest anything other than a quiet Friday night at home. But as I walked up the brick pathway I'd helped Robert lay 2 summers ago, I started noticing details that didn't fit the story I'd been told. The grass had been freshly cut, which seemed odd for someone dealing with a work emergency. The front flower beds had been weeded recently, and there were 2 bags of mulch stacked neatly by the garage that hadn't been there when I drove by last weekend. This was the kind of yard preparation you did when you were expecting company, not when you were canceling social events. I raised my hand to knock on the front door, but before my knuckles could make contact, I heard something that stopped me cold. Laughter. Not just one person, but multiple voices, the kind of overlapping conversation that happens when you get a group of people together around a dinner table. And underneath that, music. Not television music, but actual background music, the kind you put on when you're hosting a party. My chest felt tight as I moved away from the front door and walked around to the side of the house, where a gap in the curtains gave me a direct view into the dining room.
What is how the rhythm like a physical blow, like Someone e taken a sledgehammer to my ribcage and knocked all the air out of my lungs.
There was my entire family, seated around Sarah's dining room table, laughing and eating and celebrating like they didn't have a care in the world.
Robert sat at the head of the table wearing a paper birthday hat, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning.
Sarah was bringing out a cake, not the German chocolate cake I'd bought that afternoon, but an elaborate two-layer creation with Happy 50th Birthday written in blue frosting. My son Michael was there with his wife Jennifer and their 2 kids, my grandchildren who I hadn't seen in 3 weeks because they'd been too busy with school activities. But it wasn't just my immediate family. My brother-in-law Frank was there, Martha's sister Dorothy, even my old neighbor Pete Morrison who'd moved across town last year. This wasn't some impromptu gathering that had happened after the cancellation. This was the party, the exact party that was supposed to include me, happening exactly as planned, just without the guest of honor's father. I stood there in the cold October air, watching my family celebrate through that window like I was looking at someone else's life, someone else's family. They were all dressed up, everyone had brought gifts, and the table was set with Sarah's good china, the wedding set that Martha and I had given her 8 years ago. This was a full production, weeks in the planning, not something you could pull together on short notice after a work emergency got resolved. The worst part wasn't just that they were celebrating without me. It was how happy they all looked. Nobody seemed concerned about my absence. Nobody was checking their phone to see if I'd called. Nobody appeared to be missing anything or anyone. They were having the time of their lives, and I wasn't even a memory in that room. I watched Robert blow out his birthday candles while everyone cheered, and I realized this wasn't just about one lie or one canceled dinner. This was about my family deciding that their lives were better without me in them. That whatever I brought to family gatherings, whatever value I thought I added, was actually just an obligation they'd rather avoid. Standing there in the darkness, holding a German chocolate cake and a bottle of expensive bourbon for a man who was already celebrating his birthday without me, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not just hurt, though that was there in waves. Not just anger, though that was building like a storm front. What I felt was clarity, cold and sharp as winter air. My family had made a choice about what my place was in their lives. Now it was time for me to make some choices of my own. I stood there for another 30 seconds, watching my family through that window, giving myself time to decide exactly how I wanted to handle this. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk back to my truck, and pretend I'd never seen what I'd just witnessed. Go home, throw away the cake, pour myself 3 fingers of that bourbon, and spend the weekend figuring out how to live with the knowledge that my own family preferred celebrating without me. But that wasn't who Harold Thompson was. I'd spent 40 years in construction learning that when you discover a structural problem, you don't just cover it up with fresh paint and hope it goes away. You tear into it, expose the damage, and fix it properly, even if the process is messy and expensive and nobody wants to deal with it. I walked back to the front door, shifted the cake box to my left arm, and knocked. Not the gentle, polite knock of someone who wasn't sure they were welcome. A firm, confident knock that said I had every right to be there, because I did. This was supposed to be my family dinner, after all. The laughter inside stopped immediately, like someone had flipped a switch. I could hear chairs scraping against the hardwood floor, hushed voices having a rapid conversation about what to do. Through the frosted glass panel in the door, I saw a shadow approaching, hesitant steps that suggested whoever was coming to answer wasn't eager to see who was on the other side. The door opened, and there was Sarah, wearing the blue dress she saved for special occasions, her hair done up in a way that had taken time and effort. Her face went through about 6 different expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, guilt, panic, and finally a forced smile that looked like it physically hurt to produce.
Daddy,
"What are you doing here?" Her voice was an octave higher than normal, the kind of strained cheerfulness you hear from someone trying to convince you everything is fine when it obviously isn't. "Brought Robert's birthday cake," I said, holding up Mueller's box like it was the most natural thing in the world. "And that bottle of Woodford Reserve he's been wanting to try. Figured since his work emergency got resolved, we could still have a little celebration." Behind Sarah, I could see movement as people scrambled to figure out how to handle this situation. Robert appeared in the hallway, still wearing that ridiculous birthday hat, his face flushed red with what I assumed was a combination of alcohol and embarrassment. My son Michael came up behind him, and I watched him calculate whether he could somehow explain away what was obviously happening. "Dad," Michael said, stepping around Sarah, we weren't expecting." "Clearly," I said, looking past both of them into the dining room where my brother-in-law Frank was sitting frozen with a forkful of birthday cake halfway to his mouth. "Looks like quite a crowd for a work emergency. Hope nobody's getting overtime pay for this." The silence that followed was the kind you hear right before a building collapses, that moment when everyone realizes the structure is coming down and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. Dorothy, Martha's sister, actually had the decency to look ashamed. She'd been at our kitchen table countless times over the years, eating my cooking, accepting my help with her various financial crises, and now here she was, part of whatever conspiracy had decided I wasn't worth including. "Daddy, I can explain," Sarah started, but I held up my hand. "I'm sure you can, sweetheart. I'm sure there's a very reasonable explanation for why Robert's work emergency got resolved just in time for everyone except me to enjoy his birthday party. I stepped into the house without being invited, because this was still my family, and I still had rights here, even if they'd apparently forgotten that. The smell hit me immediately. Roast beef, garlic mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, all the foods Robert loved, all prepared with care and attention. This wasn't leftovers thrown together after a cancelled event. This was a feast that had been planned and prepared for exactly the number of people who were sitting around that table. "Now then," I said, setting the cake down on Sarah's coffee table and looking around at 8 of the most important people in my life, all of whom were staring at me like I was a ghost who'd crashed their private party.
"Who wants to tell me what is really going on here?"
The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, 8 people trying to figure out how to explain the unexplainable. I could practically hear the wheels turning in their heads, each of them calculating whether there was some story that could make this situation look innocent, some explanation that would let them keep pretending they were good people who just made a small mistake. Robert finally broke the silence, pulling off that ridiculous birthday hat and setting it on the side table like he was trying to look more serious, more adult. "Hank, look, I know this looks bad, but we can explain everything." "I'm listening," I said, settling into Martha's old favorite chair, the wingback she'd bought at an estate sale in 1995. I wasn't going anywhere until I heard exactly how they planned to justify this betrayal. "The thing is," Sarah jumped in, her voice still pitched high with nerves, "we were going to reschedule with you for next weekend. Make it just the 3 of us, more intimate, you know? Robert's been so stressed with work, and we thought maybe a smaller group would be better for everyone." I nodded like I was seriously considering this explanation, then looked around the room at the 8 people who apparently constituted a smaller group. "So Dorothy drove down from Toledo for this intimate little gathering? And Frank took the night off from the VFW for Robert's stress-free birthday." My brother-in-law Frank had the grace to look embarrassed. He'd been married to Martha's sister for 36 years, knew me well enough to understand that I wasn't buying any of this diplomatic nonsense. "Dad," Michael said, leaning forward in his chair, "maybe we should have talked to you first, but we thought—"
"You thought what, son?"
"That I wouldn't notice? That I'd just accept the cancellation and spend Friday night alone watching television." I looked directly at Michael, the boy I'd taught to throw a curveball, whose college tuition I'd helped pay when his academic scholarships weren't quite enough. Or did you think I was too old and stupid to figure out when my own family was lying to me? That's when I noticed something that made my blood pressure spike 20 points. On the kitchen counter, barely visible through the archway, I could see a stack of receipts held down by Sarah's coffee mug. But what caught my attention wasn't the receipts themselves, it was what was sitting next to them.
A credit card. My credit card.
The MasterCard I'd given Sarah 3 months ago when her car needed emergency repairs and she was short on cash. I got up from the chair and walked into the kitchen, everyone's eyes following me like I was a bomb that might explode at any moment. I picked up that credit card, my name embossed right there in raised letters, and looked at the receipts underneath.
Ole Foods, $127.83.
Myers Wine Shop, $89.47.
Costco, $156.92.
The dates on every single receipt were from yesterday and today. "Sarah," I called out, my voice carrying the kind of calm that anyone who'd worked construction would recognize as the moment right before the foreman loses his absolute mind.
Come here, please.
She appeared in the kitchen doorway, wringing her hands like a little girl who'd been caught stealing cookies.
Yes, Daddy?
I held up the credit card and the receipts. Want to explain to me why my credit card was used to buy groceries and wine for a party I wasn't invited to? The color drained out of her face so fast I thought she might faint. "Daddy, I was going to pay you back. I just didn't have enough cash on hand, and Robert's credit cards are maxed out from some unexpected expenses. So you decided to use mine, without asking, to pay for a celebration you specifically excluded me from." I was still speaking quietly, but everyone in that house could hear me clearly. "Do you understand what that means, Sarah?" "It means I made a mistake," she whispered.
No, sweetheart.
"It means you didn't just lie to me and exclude me from your family gathering. You made me pay for the privilege of being excluded." I set the receipts back down on the counter and looked at my daughter, this woman I'd raised to value honesty and respect above everything else. "You took my money to buy food and drinks for everyone except me. You literally made me finance my own humiliation." Robert stepped into the kitchen, probably thinking he could smooth this over with his usual charm. "Hank, we're going to pay you back every penny. This was just a temporary cash flow issue." I turned to look at him, this man who'd been part of our family for 8 years, who'd eaten countless meals at my table, who'd borrowed my tools and my money and my truck more times than I could count. "Robert, how much did this little party cost?" He glanced at Sarah, then back at me. "About $400 total." $400, I repeated, looking around at the elaborate spread, the decorations, the expensive wine. $400 of my money, spent on a party I wasn't invited to, on a night when my daughter told me to stay home because your work was too important for family celebrations. The room had gone completely silent again, but this time it wasn't the silence of people trying to figure out what to say. This was the silence of people realizing they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross, done something that couldn't be undone with apologies and explanations. I put my credit card in my wallet and looked at every face in that room. "I think it's time for me to go home now." I didn't storm out. I didn't slam doors or raise my voice or give them the satisfaction of seeing me lose control. After 40 years of managing construction crews, I'd learned that real power comes from staying calm when everyone else is falling apart. So I walked back into that dining room, looked at each person sitting around the table that should have included me, and spoke with the kind of quiet authority that made people pay attention. "I want everyone to understand something," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence. "This isn't about hurt feelings. This isn't about me being overly sensitive or dramatic. This is about discovering that the people I've spent my entire adult life caring for decided that my company wasn't worth including, but my money was worth taking." Dorothy, Martha's sister, finally found her voice. "Hank, we never meant for it to happen like this. Sarah was going to call you tomorrow, explain everything, maybe plan something special just for the old widower who might get too emotional and ruin everyone's good time? I cut her off, but my tone stayed level, controlled.
Dorothy, you've known me for 35 years.
When have I ever been anything but grateful to be included in family gatherings? When have I ever made any of you uncomfortable with my presence? She couldn't answer that, because there wasn't an answer. I'd been the same person at every family event since Martha died. Present, helpful, appreciative, maybe a little quieter than I used to be, but never difficult, never demanding, never anything other than a father and grandfather who wanted to be part of his family's lives. Michael stood up from his chair, and I could see him struggling with whether to try defending this situation or just accepting that there was no defense for it. Dad, I think we all just got caught up in trying to make things easier for everyone, and we didn't think about how it would feel from your perspective. Easier for everyone except me, I said.
And you're right, son.
You didn't think about my perspective. You didn't think about how it would feel to discover that my own family has been tolerating my presence instead of enjoying it. I picked up the German chocolate cake from the coffee table and handed it to Robert, who was still standing there looking like he wished he could disappear into the wallpaper.
Happy birthday, Robert.
I hope it's everything you wanted it to be. He took the cake with hands that weren't quite steady.
Hank, please don't leave like this.
We can fix this. We can make it right. How exactly would you propose to do that? I asked. Are you going to erase the fact that you all planned this party without me? Are you going to give me back the naive belief I had yesterday that my family actually wanted me around? Are you going to explain how charging groceries to my credit card without asking somehow makes this situation better? Nobody had an answer for that either, because there wasn't one. Some things, once broken, don't get fixed with apologies and good intentions. I walked to the front door, aware that 8 pairs of eyes were following my every movement, 8 people who were probably hoping I'd change my mind, turn around, accept some weak explanation, and pretend this whole thing had been a misunderstanding. But I'd spent too many years in construction to accept shoddy work, and this was shoddy work of the worst kind. At the door, I turned back one last time. Sarah, I'll expect you to pay back the $400 within the week. Consider it the final transaction in our father-daughter relationship. Her face crumpled when I said that, but I continued anyway. Michael, I hope your children never have to experience what it feels like to discover their parents think they're a burden. I opened the door and stepped out into the cool October night, leaving behind the warmth and laughter and family celebration that was supposed to have included me. As I walked down that brick pathway toward my truck, I could hear voices behind me, rapid conversation about what to do next, whether someone should follow me, how to handle the aftermath of what they'd all just witnessed. But I wasn't interested in their damage control. I was interested in something much more important, figuring out exactly how to teach 8 people who thought they could take advantage of Harold Thompson's kindness that they'd seriously miscalculated their target. By the time I reached my truck, I wasn't hurt anymore. I was focused. And that, I realized, was going to make all the difference in what happened next.
I drove home in complete silence. No radio. No noise except the steady hum of my truck's engine and the sound of my uncontrolled breathing.
The streets of Millbrook looked different somehow, like I was seeing them through new eyes, the eyes of a man who just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his place in the world had been an illusion. But instead of feeling lost or confused, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The cold, calculating focus that had made me successful in construction, the ability to assess damage and create a plan to fix it. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly what my first move was going to be. I didn't go into the house immediately. Instead, I sat in my truck with the engine off, pulled out my cell phone, and dialed the customer service number on the back of my MasterCard. The automated system tried to route me through 6 different menus, but I knew the magic words that would get me to a human being. I need to report fraudulent charges on my account, I said when the representative finally came on the line. I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Thompson. Can you tell me which charges you'd like to dispute? I had those receipts memorized. Whole Foods on October 15th for $127.83, Myers Wine Shop for $89.47, and Costco for $156.92. All unauthorized purchases made by someone who had access to my card without permission. The representative was professional and efficient. Within 10 minutes, those charges were frozen pending investigation, and my credit card was canceled with a new one being expedited to my address. But more importantly, any pending charges that hadn't been processed yet would be automatically declined. If Sarah and Robert had planned any additional purchases for their celebration, they were about to discover that their financing had just disappeared. My next call was to my bank. I need to put a freeze on my checking account, I told the after-hours service representative. Someone has been making unauthorized withdrawals, and I need to protect my assets. That wasn't technically true, since I'd never given Sarah access to my checking account, but it was a precautionary measure. If she'd been using my credit card without asking, there was no telling what other financial liberties she might have taken. The third call was to my attorney, William Morrison, the same lawyer who'd handled Martha's estate and helped me set up my will 2 years ago. William had been practicing law in Millbrook for 30 years, knew everyone worth knowing, and had a reputation for being both thorough and discreet. "Hank, it's almost 10 o'clock on a Friday night," William said when he answered. "This must be serious." "It is, Bill. I need to schedule an appointment for Monday morning. I want to make some changes to my will, and I want to explore my legal options regarding unauthorized use of credit cards." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Unauthorized use? Are we talking about identity theft? We're talking about family members who think they can help themselves to my money without asking. How much trouble can someone get into for using a credit card that doesn't belong to them? Depends on the amount and the intent, William said, and I could hear him switching into lawyer mode. If we're talking about family members who had legitimate access but exceeded their authority, it's usually a civil matter. But if we're talking about deliberate fraud, that can become criminal pretty quickly. What if they used the card to pay for a social event I was specifically excluded from? Another pause, longer this time. "Hank, what exactly happened tonight?" I gave him the abbreviated version. The canceled dinner, showing up anyway, discovering the party in progress, finding my credit card being used to finance my own exclusion from a family celebration. William listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers do when they're calculating the legal angles of a situation. "Monday morning, 9 o'clock, he said when I finished. "Bring any receipts, records, or documentation you have. And Hank, don't make any more financial moves until we talk. If you're planning to change your will based on tonight's events, I want to make sure you do it in a way that can't be challenged later." After I hung up with William, I sat in my truck for another few minutes, looking at my house, this simple 2-story structure that had sheltered my family for over 40 years. Martha and I had brought both our children home from the hospital to this house. We'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and graduations in these rooms. I'd always assumed that when I died, this house would go to Sarah and Michael, along with whatever money I'd managed to save over the years. But tonight had changed that assumption. Tonight had made me realize that maybe I needed to reconsider who deserved to benefit from 40 years of hard work and careful saving. Maybe there were other people who actually valued my presence instead of just tolerating it, who would make better use of whatever I left behind. I finally went inside, made myself a cup of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. At the top of the page, I wrote "New Plans" and underlined it twice. Then I started making a list of everyone who'd been at that party tonight, everyone who'd participated in the decision to exclude me while spending my money. Each name was going to cost them something. The only question was how much. Saturday morning I woke up at my usual 5:30, made my coffee, and settled into my routine with a sense of anticipation I hadn't felt in years. It was like Christmas morning when you're 8 years old, knowing that something exciting is waiting for you under the tree. Except in this case, what was waiting was the sound of my phone ringing with increasingly desperate calls from people who were about to discover that actions have consequences. The first call came at 7:23 a.m. Sarah's number on my caller ID, probably calling to apologize, to try to smooth things over before they got any worse. I let it go to voicemail. The second call came at 7:31, then another at 7:45. By 8 o'clock, I had 6 missed calls from Sarah and 3 from Michael. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and listened to the voicemails.
Daddy, please call me back.
I know you're upset, but we need to talk about this like adults.
Please don't do anything rash.
Sarah's voice was tight with worry, the kind of controlled panic you hear from someone who's starting to realize they've made a very expensive mistake. Michael's messages were more direct. Dad, Sarah told me what happened last night. I know we screwed up, but cutting off your credit card seems a little extreme. Call me back so we can figure this out.
A little extreme.
My son thought it was extreme for me to cancel my own credit card after discovering someone had been using it without permission to finance a party I wasn't invited to. The lack of self-awareness was almost impressive.
At 8:47, my phone rang again.
This time it was Robert, which was interesting because Robert never called me directly. He usually went through Sarah, treating me like some kind of obstacle that needed to be managed rather than a person worth talking to. "Hank, we've got a problem," he said when I finally answered. The credit card got declined this morning when Sarah tried to buy groceries. The bank said the account was closed due to fraudulent activity. "That's unfortunate," I said, taking a sip of my coffee. "Did they say what kind of fraudulent activity?" "Come on, Hank, you know exactly what happened. You called them and reported the charges from yesterday as unauthorized." Robert's voice was getting louder, more aggressive. "That's going to cause serious problems for us. Sarah's already embarrassed at the grocery store, and now we've got 3 other charges that are going to bounce." "3 other charges?" I asked, genuinely curious. "What 3 other charges?" "The catering deposit for next weekend, the payment to the party rental company, and the check Sarah wrote to cover the babysitter from last night." Robert was talking fast now, panic creeping into his voice. "If those payments get rejected, we're going to have late fees, bounced check charges, and a bunch of vendors who think we're deadbeats."
He almost laughed out loud.
They hadn't just used my credit card for yesterday's party. They'd been planning to use it for future expenses, ongoing costs related to their social life that they'd simply assumed I would cover without being consulted. The depth of their presumption was staggering. "Robert, let me ask you something," I said, settling back in my kitchen chair. "When you made all these plans, when you arranged these payments, did it occur to you to ask if I wanted to finance your social calendar?" "It wasn't like that, Hank. Sarah was going to pay you back. She just needed a little time to." "Time to what? Time to use more of my money for more events I wouldn't be invited to? Time to establish a pattern where I become your personal bank account with no say in how my money gets spent?" The silence on the other end told me Robert was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what they'd done. This wasn't just about one party or one night of hurt feelings. This was about a fundamental violation of trust and respect that had probably been building for months without me realizing it. "Look, we can fix this," Robert said finally. "We can pay you back, make it right, make sure nothing like this ever happens again." "How are you going to pay me back, Robert? You just told me your credit cards are maxed out and you don't have cash for groceries. Where exactly is this repayment money going to come from?" Another silence, longer this time. I could practically hear the wheels turning as he tried to figure out an answer that didn't involve asking me for more money to pay back the money they'd already taken. "We'll figure something out," he said weakly. "I'm sure you will," I replied. "But you'll figure it out without any help from me." Consider this a learning experience about the importance of asking permission before spending other people's money. I hung up and immediately called William Morrison's office, even though it was Saturday morning. William was old school, the kind of lawyer who worked weekends when his clients needed him, and I had a feeling he'd want to hear about this latest development. "The situation is escalating," I told him when he answered. "They've been planning to use my credit card for multiple future expenses without asking. We're not just talking about one unauthorized transaction, we're talking about a pattern of financial presumption that goes way beyond last night's party." "That changes things significantly," William said. "That suggests intent to defraud rather than a one-time mistake. How do you want to proceed?" I looked out my kitchen window at the Saturday morning sunshine, at the normal suburban street where normal families were probably having normal weekend conversations that didn't involve credit card fraud and family betrayals. "I want to proceed with maximum impact and minimum mercy," I said. "It's time my family learned that there are consequences for treating people like walking ATM machines." By noon on Saturday, I'd received 14 more phone calls, 2 text messages, and what appeared to be a family-wide panic attack. Michael had driven over to Sarah's house, probably for an emergency strategy session about how to handle their father's sudden transformation from pushover to problem. I knew this because Jennifer, Michael's wife, had called me at 11:30 to check on how I was doing, and casually mentioned that Michael was helping Sarah sort through some misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. That's what they were calling deliberate deception and financial theft now. At 12:15, Sarah finally showed up at my front door. Not calling first, not asking permission, just appearing on my doorstep with red-rimmed eyes and the kind of desperate expression that suggested she'd been crying for hours. I watched her through the peephole for a full minute before opening the door, letting her stand there and think about what she was going to say, how she was going to try to fix something that couldn't be fixed with tears and apologies. "Daddy, please, we need to talk," she said the moment I opened the door. "This has gotten completely out of hand." "Has it?" I asked, not inviting her in. "From my perspective, things are finally starting to make sense. Come in, but understand that this isn't a negotiation. This is me explaining to you how things are going to work from now on." She followed me into the living room, perching on the edge of Martha's old chair like she was afraid to get too comfortable. I sat across from her in my recliner, the same chair where I'd received her lying phone call 2 days ago, and waited for her to start talking. "The credit card situation is causing serious problems," she began, wringing her hands like she'd done as a child when she was in trouble. "Robert's boss found out about the bounced payments, and now there are questions about Robert's financial stability at work. We could lose health insurance, job security, everything." "That's unfortunate," I said, "but I'm not sure what that has to do with me."
"Daddy, please don't pretend you don't understand what is happening here."
"You're destroying our lives over one mistake, one bad decision that we're willing to make right." I leaned forward in my chair and looked directly into my daughter's eyes, the same blue eyes that Martha had, the eyes that had melted my heart for 32 years. "Sarah, let me explain something to you about consequences. When you lie to someone, when you exclude them from family events, when you use their money without permission, you don't get to control how they respond to that betrayal. You created this situation. I'm simply deciding how to live with what you've shown me about your character."
"So what do you want?"
"What's it going to take to fix this?" Now we were getting to the heart of the matter. Sarah wanted to know the price of her forgiveness, the cost of returning things to normal. But normal was exactly what I never wanted to return to.
"I'll tell you what you want," he said, settling back in my chair.
"First, I want every penny of the money you spent on that party returned to me within 72 hours. Not next week, not when it's convenient, not when Robert's next paycheck comes in. 72 hours. Sarah's face went pale. "Daddy, that's $400. We don't have that kind of cash just sitting around." "Then you'll figure out how to get it. Sell something, Borrow from someone who actually cares about you. Get a second job. I don't care how you solve the problem, but you will solve it. What else? She asked, because she could tell from my tone that the money was just the beginning. Second, I want a written apology from every person who was at that party. Not some generic sorry for the misunderstanding nonsense. I want specific acknowledgement of what they did wrong and why it was unacceptable.
Every person, Sarah.
Including Robert, including Michael, including your Aunt Dorothy. A written apology? Daddy, that's humiliating. Good. Humiliation builds character. Maybe if you'd experienced a little more of it growing up, you wouldn't think it was acceptable to treat your father like a wallet with legs. Sarah started crying again, but I wasn't moved. I'd seen her cry her way out of consequences too many times over the years, and it wasn't going to work anymore. Third, I continued, you're going to close any credit accounts, store cards, or financial arrangements that have my name attached to them. I will no longer be your financial backup plan for emergencies, vacations, impulse purchases, or social events. But what if we have a real emergency? What if something terrible happens and we need help? Then you'll handle it the way adults handle emergencies. You'll use your own resources, you'll ask for help from people who actually want to provide it, or you'll figure out how to solve your own problems. I stood up from my chair and walked to the window, looking out at the street where normal families were having normal Saturday afternoons. Sarah, for the past 2 years, you've treated me like a convenience. Someone to call when you need money, someone to include when you need extra hands for projects, someone to tolerate at family events because excluding me would look bad to other people. But last night you showed me that I don't even rate tolerance anymore. That's not true, Daddy.
We love you.
I turned back to face her. No, you love what I provide for you. You love having a father who never says no, who always helps out, who can be counted on to solve problems and pay bills and show up whenever you need something. But you don't love me enough to want my company at celebrations, and you don't respect me enough to ask before spending my money. Sarah was crying harder now, but I had one more condition to deliver. Fourth and finally, you have exactly 1 week to decide whether you want to be my daughter or Robert's wife. Because after what I discovered last night, I'm not interested in being part of a family that thinks I'm optional. Sarah left my house that Saturday afternoon looking like she'd been hit by a freight train, and I spent the rest of the weekend in a state of calm that I hadn't experienced since Martha's death. It was the peace that comes from finally taking action instead of just enduring whatever treatment other people decided you deserved. By Monday morning, I was ready for the conversation that would change everything permanently. William Morrison's law office occupied the second floor of a restored Victorian house on Main Street, the kind of place that suggested both tradition and discretion. I'd been climbing those narrow stairs for over 20 years, first for real estate closings, then for business contracts, finally for Martha's estate planning. But this Monday morning felt different. This time I wasn't there to protect what I'd built. I was there to decide who deserved to inherit it. "You look like a man who's made some hard decisions," William said when I settled into the leather chair across from his mahogany desk. He'd been my attorney long enough to read my moods, and he could obviously tell that something fundamental had shifted since our phone conversation. "I've made the only decision that makes sense," I replied. "I want to remove Sarah from my will entirely. Everything that was going to her, the house, the savings accounts, the investment portfolio, I want it redirected." William leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in that way lawyers do when they're about to deliver serious advice. "Hank, that's approximately $340,000 in assets. Are you absolutely certain you want to make that kind of change based on what happened Friday night?" "I'm not making it based on Friday night alone. I'm making it based on what Friday night revealed about my daughter's character. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, Bill. This was a deliberate pattern of deception and financial presumption that probably goes back months." I pulled out a folder containing all the documentation I'd gathered over the weekend. Credit card statements showing previous unauthorized charges I'd overlooked, receipts for emergencies that turned out to be social expenses, bank records showing cash withdrawals from the ATM card I'd given Sarah for genuine emergencies only. "Look at this pattern," I said, spreading the papers across his desk. "In the past 6 months, she spent nearly $3,000 of my money on things she never told me about. Restaurants, clothing stores, spa treatments, even a weekend trip to Chicago that she told me was a work conference." William studied the documents, his expression growing more serious as he recognized the scope of the financial deception. "This does suggest a pattern of unauthorized use rather than isolated incidents."
"Exactly.
And here's the thing that really bothers me. If she'd asked for any of this money directly, I probably would have given it to her. Sarah could have called me up and said, 'Dad, I want to take Robert out for a nice dinner,' or 'Dad, I need some help with a weekend getaway,' and I would have written her a check without hesitation. But she chose to take it without asking, which means she chose to treat me like a resource instead of a person." I leaned forward in my chair, feeling the full weight of what I was about to set in motion. "Bill, I want you to understand something. This isn't about the money. I've given away more than $3,000 in worse causes. This is about discovering that my own daughter thinks so little of me that she'd rather steal from me than have an honest conversation about what she needs. Where do you want Sarah's portion of the estate to go?" I'd been thinking about that question all weekend. "I want to establish a trust fund for my grandchildren's education, but with conditions. They can only access the money if they maintain good grades and demonstrate good character. And I want a significant portion to go to the Millbrook Senior Center, specifically for programs that help elderly people who've been abandoned by their families." William made notes on his legal pad, but I could see him calculating the implications of what I was proposing. "Hank, have you considered the possibility that Sarah might contest this will change? She could argue that you were acting under emotional distress, that you weren't thinking clearly when you made these decisions." "Let her try," I said. "I've got documentation of unauthorized credit card use, I've got witness testimony about the party I was excluded from, and I've got a clear pattern of financial deception. Any judge who looks at this evidence will see that I'm not acting out of spite. I'm acting out of self-preservation."
"What about Michael? Is he remaining in the will?"
"For now. Michael participated in the deception, but he wasn't the architect of it. He gets one chance to prove that he's learned something from watching his sister's consequences. If he makes the right choice, he keeps his inheritance. If he follows Sarah's lead, he loses it too." William finished writing and looked up at me. "This is going to devastate Sarah when she finds out."
"Good," I said without hesitation.
"Maybe devastation will teach her something that kindness and generosity never could." "When do you want to tell her about these changes?" I thought about that for a moment. Sarah had 6 more days to meet my 4 conditions, 6 more days to prove that she understood the magnitude of what she'd done and was willing to make genuine amends. Part of me hoped she would surprise me, that she'd find a way to demonstrate real remorse and real change. But a bigger part of me, the part that had spent 2 years being treated like a convenient solution to other people's problems, hoped she wouldn't. Because some lessons are only learned when the cost becomes unbearable, and my daughter was long overdue for an education in consequences. "Let's wait until next weekend," I said. "Give her time to either prove me wrong about her character or confirm everything I've suspected.
Either way, she'll have earned whatever she gets."
Wednesday afternoon, Michael showed up at my door unannounced, which was unusual for him. My older son typically called ahead, scheduled visits, treated my house like an appointment on his calendar rather than a place he was always welcome. But that afternoon he looked agitated, uncomfortable, like a man carrying information he didn't want to possess. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, stepping into my living room without his usual pleasantries about the weather or work. "It's about Sarah, about what really happened last Friday night." I gestured for him to sit down, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept running his hands through his hair. In 45 years of being his father, I'd learned to recognize when Michael was wrestling with his conscience, and this was definitely one of those moments. "I found out something yesterday that I should have discovered a long time ago," he began, his voice tight with what sounded like anger. "Robert has been planning this kind of thing for months, Dad.
The exclusion, the financial manipulation, all of it.
It wasn't Sarah's idea. That got my attention immediately. What do you mean, planning this kind of thing?" Michael pulled out his phone and set it on my coffee table.
He recorded a conversation yesterday between Robert and his brother Dave.
They didn't know I was in the house, and I heard Robert bragging about how he'd finally found a way to manage the old man problem.
The phrase hit me like a physical blow. The old man problem.
That's how my son-in-law referred to me when he thought no one was listening. "Play it," I said. Michael touched the screen, and Robert's voice filled my living room, clear and unmistakable. "The thing about these old guys is they're so desperate to feel needed that they'll pay for anything if you make them think they're helping family. Sarah's dad has been bankrolling our social life for months, and he doesn't even realize it because I convinced Sarah to handle it through credit cards and emergencies instead of direct requests." I felt my jaw clench as Robert's voice continued, "The birthday party thing was perfect. I told Sarah that her dad would be too depressing at a celebration, that he'd spend the whole night talking about his dead wife and making everyone uncomfortable. She bought it completely because she's been thinking the same thing but was too guilty to admit it." Michael paused the recording and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a combination of rage and regret that suggested he was finally seeing his brother-in-law clearly for the first time. "There's more, Dad."
It gets worse.
He restarted the recording. "The best part is that when he gets upset about being excluded, Sarah feels so guilty that she lets me use his credit card for whatever we need to make it up to him later. It's like having a blank check from someone who's too emotional to think straight. Old widowers are gold mines if you know how to work them." I had to grip the arms of my chair to keep from standing up and putting my fist through the wall. This wasn't just casual disrespect or thoughtless selfishness. This was calculated exploitation, a deliberate strategy to use my grief and my love for my family against me. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice barely controlled. "Based on what I heard, at least 6 months. Maybe longer." Michael's hands were shaking now, whether from anger or shame, I couldn't tell. "Dad, I had no idea. I thought the party thing was just Sarah being thoughtless, maybe Robert being a little selfish. I never imagined it was this systematic." The recording continued. "She thinks I'm protecting her from having to manage her father's neediness, but really I'm protecting us from having to pretend we want him around. The man's a walking guilt trip since his wife died. Every conversation becomes a therapy session. Every family gathering turns into a memorial service. Sarah's too nice to cut him off, but she's relieved when I give her excuses not to include him." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where normal families were living normal lives without having to worry about being financially exploited by their own relatives. The level of betrayal was staggering, but what hurt most was the realization that Robert had been manipulating Sarah's genuine guilt about my grief, using her love for me as a weapon against both of us. "Michael, does Sarah know you have this recording?" "Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first, figure out what we should do." He looked up at me with eyes that reminded me of the little boy who used to come to me when he'd broken something and needed help fixing it.
"Dad, I'm so sorry."
I should have paid more attention, should have questioned why you kept getting excluded from things. I let Robert convince me that you were being too sensitive, that we needed to give you space to grieve. I turned back to face my son. "What else did you hear?"
Robert is planning something bigger.
He mentioned that if you keep causing problems about money, he's going to convince Sarah to have you declared mentally incompetent due to grief-induced depression. He's already been talking to people about your erratic behavior since Mom died, building a case that you're not thinking clearly.
De piace suddenly clicked into plus.
All those concerned questions about my mental health, all those suggestions that I was taking things too hard or not coping well with Martha's death. Robert hadn't been worried about my well-being. He'd been laying groundwork for a legal challenge to my competency. "Son," I said, settling back into my chair with a calmness that surprised even me, "I think it's time your sister learned exactly who she married." That evening, Michael and I drove to Sarah's house together, the recording loaded on his phone and a plan that would either save my relationship with my daughter or destroy it completely. I'd spent the afternoon thinking about what Robert had said, about how he'd been systematically manipulating Sarah's guilt and my grief to create a financial arrangement that benefited him while isolating me from my own family. The lights were on when we pulled into their driveway, and through the front window I could see Sarah and Robert having what appeared to be an intense conversation in their living room. Sarah was pacing back and forth, gesturing with her hands in the animated way she'd done since childhood when she was upset. Robert was sitting on their couch, looking like a man who was trying to control a situation that was slipping away from him. We knocked, and Sarah answered the door with red-rimmed eyes and the exhausted expression of someone who'd been crying on and off for days. When she saw both Michael and me standing there together, her face went through a series of rapid changes: surprise, hope, and then worry as she realized this probably wasn't a social visit.
"Daddy, Michael, what are you doing here?"
"We need to have a family conversation," I said, stepping into the house with Michael right behind me. "All four of us right now." Robert stood up from the couch, and I could see him instantly calculating whether this was a problem he could charm his way out of or something more serious. He'd gotten very good at managing family dynamics over the years, at positioning himself as the reasonable voice when conflicts arose, but tonight he was going to discover that his manipulation tactics had finally met their match. "Sarah," Michael said, pulling out his phone, "I need you to listen to something I recorded yesterday. And I need you to listen to the whole thing before you say anything." "Michael, what is this about?" she asked, but she sat down in her favorite chair, the blue recliner that had been her sanctuary since college. "This is about your husband explaining to his brother exactly how he's been using Dad's money and manipulating both of you for months." Michael's voice was harder than I'd ever heard it, the tone of a man who'd discovered something that disgusted him. He played the recording, and I watched my daughter's face change as Robert's voice filled the room with his casual description of financial exploitation and emotional manipulation. Sarah's expression went from confusion to disbelief to horror as she heard her husband describe her father as the old man problem and explain his strategy for using my grief as a financial resource. When the recording reached the part about having me declared mentally incompetent, Sarah's face went completely white. She looked at Robert like she was seeing him for the first time, like the man she'd married had suddenly revealed himself to be a complete stranger. "Robert," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "please tell me this is some kind of joke. Please tell me you didn't actually say these things." Robert's charm failed him completely. Instead of the smooth explanation I expected, he went on the offensive, attacking the messenger instead of addressing the message. "Sarah, they recorded me without permission. This is probably illegal, and it's definitely taken out of context. Your family has never liked me, and now they're trying to destroy our marriage." "Out of context?" Michael stood up, his own anger finally breaking through. "What context makes it okay to call our father the old man problem? What context makes it acceptable to brag about exploiting a widower's grief for financial gain?" Sarah was staring at Robert now with an expression I'd never seen from her before, a cold, analytical look that suggested she was reevaluating every conversation they'd had, every decision they'd made together, every family event where I'd been excluded or made to feel unwelcome. "You told me that Daddy was getting too dependent on us emotionally," she said slowly. "You said it would be healthier for him if we gave him some space to process his grief independently. But that wasn't what you were doing, was it? Sarah, honey, you have to understand." "Answer the question, Robert. Were you actually concerned about my father's mental health, or were you just trying to get him out of the way so you could use his money more easily?" The silence that followed was deafening. Robert looked like a man who just realized his house of cards was collapsing and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Both," he said finally. "It was both things." I did think he was becoming too needy, but I also thought we could solve our financial problems at the same time. Sarah stood up from her chair with a movement so sudden and violent that I thought she might physically attack him. Instead, she walked to their front closet and pulled out a suitcase. "Get out," she said, her voice perfectly calm and completely final.
"Get out of my house, get out of my life, and get out of my family. Sarah, you can't be serious.
We can work through this. We can go to counseling, figure out how to rebuild trust." "The only thing we need to figure out," she said, opening the suitcase and starting to throw his clothes into it, "is how quickly you can find somewhere else to live. Because I will not spend one more night under the same roof with someone who would exploit my father's grief for money." I watched my daughter choose her family over her husband, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt genuinely proud of the woman I'd raised. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my kitchen on a Sunday morning, watching my daughter make coffee in the same spot where Martha used to stand every weekend for 48 years. Sarah moved back into her childhood bedroom 3 days after Robert left, and she's been here ever since, rebuilding her life piece by piece and learning what it means to be part of a family that actually values each other's presence. The divorce was finalized last month. Robert tried to fight for half the house, but when William Morrison presented the recordings and the documented evidence of financial fraud to the judge, Robert's attorney advised him to accept whatever settlement we offered and disappear quietly. He moved back to Michigan to live with his brother, the same brother who'd listened to him brag about exploiting old widowers, without apparently seeing anything wrong with the strategy. Sarah paid back every penny of the money Robert had stolen, not just from the party, but from months of unauthorized credit card purchases. She got a second job waitressing at the Millbrook Diner, worked every weekend for 4 months, and handed me $3,847 in cash along with a letter of apology that I've read at least 50 times. The letter didn't make excuses or try to minimize what had happened. It simply acknowledged that she'd allowed herself to be manipulated into betraying the person who'd loved her most consistently throughout her entire life. Michael learned his lesson too, though his education was less expensive. When he realized how close he'd come to losing his inheritance by going along with Robert's manipulation, he made some significant changes in how he approached family relationships. Now he calls me twice a week just to talk, not because he needs something, but because he's finally learned the difference between obligation and genuine connection. The most satisfying part wasn't the money getting repaid or even the apologies. It was watching my family rediscover what they'd lost when they started taking me for granted. Sarah and I have dinner together every Sunday now, just the two of us, and she tells me about her new job at the elementary school, her plans to go back to college for her master's degree, her slow process of learning to trust her own judgment again after years of letting Robert make decisions for both of them. Last week, she brought up the subject I'd been waiting for her to address. "Daddy, I know you changed your will when all this happened. I don't know what you decided, and I don't want to pressure you to tell me, but I want you to know that I understand why you did it. If I were in your position, I probably would have done the same thing." That conversation happened on a Tuesday evening while we were cleaning up after dinner, the same domestic routine that Martha and I had shared for decades. I looked at my daughter, this woman who'd made terrible choices but had found the courage to face the consequences and change her life, and I realized that the lesson had been learned completely. "Sarah," I said, drying the last plate and setting it in the cabinet, "I called William Morrison yesterday.
You're back in the will, full inheritance, no conditions attached.
You earned it back by proving that you're the daughter I raised, not the woman Robert tried to turn you into." She cried then, not the desperate tears of someone trying to manipulate sympathy, but the relieved tears of someone who'd finally found her way back to the person she was supposed to be. The Millbrook Senior Center received a significant donation anyway, funded by the house Robert lost in the divorce settlement. Sarah insisted on that, said it was important for both of us to remember that there are elderly people in this world who don't have families willing to fight for them the way she'd fought to earn her way back into mine. Here's what I learned from this whole experience. Respect isn't something you inherit because you're family. It's something you earn through your actions, maintain through your choices, and lose through your betrayals. My revenge wasn't perfect because it was cruel.
It was perfect because it was educational, because it taught everyone involved that love without respect is just manipulation, and family without boundaries is just exploitation.
If this story reminded you that you should never let anyone, not even family, treat you like you're optional in your own life, leave me a comment telling me about your own experience. And don't forget to subscribe, because this old grandfather has learned that sometimes the best way to show people you love them is to refuse to accept anything less than the treatment you deserve. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their presence matters, that their boundaries are valid, and that it's never too late to demand the respect you've always deserved.